Well, it looks like the Western world is not about to fully fall apart after all, and I can finally return home from the Winchester. Yes, Trump met with various officials in Davos yesterday, and by the evening, the announcement of an Arctic framework came through. Crisis averted for now. As for what is actually in the framework, no one knows. When anyone is asked about it, no one says anything of relevance. So today, allow me to try to read between the lines to explain what probably happened. I say this because, again, no one is saying anything, leaving me to have to speculate based on my own knowledge of the actors, having observed them from afar and up close until I was kindly escorted away. Let's begin with a brief recap. About a week ago, the Trump administration began making various threats to Denmark regarding the acquisition of Greenland. True action began on it a few days later, when Trump announced the imposition of 10% tariffs on 8 European countries with ties to Greenland and Arctic security more generally, beginning on February 1st. Those would then escalate to 25% if no deal could still be reached. In response to that, I noted that a Supreme Court ruling will soon be made regarding the general legality of Trump's tariff strategies. Well, the court took a recess without having issued that ruling, so we remain in a holding pattern there. Meanwhile, the former Prime Minister of Denmark and current Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, then visited Washington without any firm progress. But as the world descended on Davos, Switzerland, everything seemingly came together quickly. Or something came together anyway. The day began with Trump giving a long speech, some scripted, but also with many digressions, which included him calling Greenland Iceland. In his defense, the two islands would more appropriately have their names flip-flopped. He removed military action as a means of acquiring Greenland, something that was never a practical consideration anyway. Cue the phrase. But he underscored how Greenland's security situation was a top priority for the United States. That apparently segued to discussions with many European leaders, including NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, which then led to a breakthrough. Trump made the announcement on Truth Social. Based on a very productive meeting that I have had with Secretary General Mark Rutte, we have formed the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland, and, in fact, the entire Arctic region. No more tariffs, for now. Additional details about expanding the security footprint on the island to be determined/announced later. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Okay, that more or less catches us up on everything that is public. Now let me speculate on what happened, because it seems that we have seen this story before, except instead of the plot taking 6 years, we condensed everything to about 6 days. Trump gets upset that the United States exerts disproportionate effort on defense within NATO, a point that European hawks largely agree with. He then makes extreme threats that risk dismantling the entire alliance if others fail to comply, a tactic that Europeans, both hawk and dove, largely do not agree with. Mark Rutte, who seemingly understands better than anyone in the world how Trump thinks, then steps in, argues to Europe that Trump has a point, and that the Allies should focus on constructive solutions to the problem. He then reports to Trump that, thanks to Trump's efforts, the alliance has broken through on a key point. Placated, Trump goes home, and Article 5 survives another day. We know that this is the story of defense spending as a percentage of GDP. What I just did a second ago was basically recap what happened at the 2018 NATO summit, when Rutte was still Prime Minister of the Netherlands. You might recall that I discussed that exchange last week, which feels like a year ago at this point. Well, if I were a betting man, then I would wager that we just witnessed a repeat of that, exchanging spending as a percentage of GDP with burden sharing in Arctic defense. I am not just saying that based on the historical parallels. It is also because Rutte is not a diplomat in a normal sense. His job is not to mediate acrimonious relations between two parties. His only job is to build political consensus on coordinated military affairs of the world's largest alliance. It would be weird, though not impossible, if all Rutte did was build a bridge between Denmark and the United States. Rather, it is better to speculate that what happened here was a mutual acceptance of the broader Arctic security situation, involving all 8 European countries under sanction threat, especially as the framing coming out of Davos was around the Arctic more generally, and not just Greenland. Along those lines, earlier in the week, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe held a briefing with allies regarding security threats in the region. As the person in charge of NATO's Allied Command operations, he shared 2 concerns. 1, gaps in the ballistic missile detection systems, and 2, an insufficient surveillance network that would spot otherwise clandestine Russian or Chinese activities in the region. The most straightforward interpretation of what happened behind closed doors is that the Allies reached a consensus on the need to do more. Trump found those concessions acceptable as compared to all of the mounting costs for continuing this game of chicken, and so they announced the framework of a deal. It remains in the concepts of a plan stage, because the parties still need to iron out exactly what goes where, and who will fill in each of those roles. But those are technical conversations for the Allies' militaries to sort out, and not a task for the politicians involved. In other words, the final deal is something that could not be done in Davos, but will likely be a bureaucratic task for another meeting in Brussels. Does that constitute a case of Trump chickening out? I will leave that up to you to interpret. The United States could have expanded its security footprint in Greenland by simply asking Denmark for permission, so that part is not a win. If the goal here was to get Europe to invest more in the region, which, again, is likely what the NATO discussions at Davos were for, then Trump got the concession that he was looking for, and therefore ended the diplomatic row. He will soon return to the United States, and getting Europe to pay its fair share in Arctic security will be a talking point for the foreseeable future. Of course, the taco question is distinct from the questions of whether all of this was worth the upending of Western diplomatic norms and the corresponding economic turmoil. Here is some back-of-the-envelope math for you on that. When the markets opened after Trump's tariff threat, the S&P 500 dropped about 1.3%. That is roughly $750 billion, which exceeds the $700 billion valuation floated for the purchase of Greenland. Now, markets only capture expectations of what they think is going to happen. If the collective belief here was that Trump was almost certainly bluffing, and there was no real threat of military action, then the 1.3% falloff reflects just the small likelihood that he was being serious. Again, this is super back of the envelope, so do not take what I'm about to say as gospel. But let's take a leap of faith and chalk that $750 billion loss as the expected loss, given the possibility of a military crisis between the United States and Europe. The betting markets place the odds of a Greenland takeover at about 1 in 6. Thus, if $750 billion reflects only the 1 in 6 risk, then the actual conflict would wipe out $4 trillion from the US economy. Again, I leave it up to you to decide whether the net benefit of Europe's potential concession here is worth risking that type of economic upheaval. One element of the agreement that remains in doubt is any sovereignty concessions that Denmark made to the United States. Rutte says that sovereignty questions were absent from the discussion, and the Danish press seems equally confused by its possibility. There is a report from the Telegraph, though, citing anonymous diplomats, that the plan is to make U.S. bases in Denmark sovereign American territory. The framework would be similar to existing British bases in Cyprus. I just want to leave this on screen for a second, because these are the actual lines from Google Maps. Just take a moment to appreciate how much of a mess it is. The UK sovereign bases are what's inside of the yellow lines. And if you are asking yourself right now, wait, the United Kingdom has sovereign bases in Cyprus, then perhaps that encapsulates how this is a distinction with relatively little importance. Well, practical importance anyway. Such sovereignty would allow the United States to expand its bases on the designated territory as it sees fit, rather than having to seek permission from Denmark for every addition. That might be important for, say, the construction of the Golden Dome project. The impact on locals would likely be small if the sovereignty grant is limited to remote areas. There may be some relatively minor mining implications for those areas as well, which is another thing that you would expect to hear as a Trump talking point for the foreseeable future. Indeed, overall, it would be the type of thing that Trump would tout as a major victory, which really is not all that important, which will still somehow make voters in Denmark very upset. Basically, it sounds like 2026 politics in a nutshell. However, multiple other outlets report that no such agreement has been reached, so it is probably best to withhold further comments on this until the parties hash out the specifics of their framework. Precisely because the sovereignty thing does not matter much anyway, and it will still upset voters in Denmark. You could see how the emphasis on the deal would instead be put on Europe increasing funding yet further as a substitute for touching the land situation. Lost in all of this is what the people who actually live in Greenland think of everything. Denmark controls Greenland's military and foreign affairs, which seems like a simple enough arrangement until you start confronting questions like whether granting the United States, or European powers for that matter, land to develop bases. Mark Carney gave the ancient Athenian general turned historian Thucydides renewed attention earlier this week. So if you will permit me to close today with the cliché, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. Still, it is frustrating to not know what the deal put into place actually looks like, never mind not to receive a comprehensive and official explanation of the specific security threats in the region. You know, the only way for me to know for sure is to head up to the Arctic for myself. And if you think I'm joking, then you have not watched this channel for long enough. It's pleasant up there this time of year, right? Just like Estonia in December? As you wait for me to get on another plane, if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.